Hey, Mike's Mastermind, Valentine's Day 2024. I should really be talking about my lovingconversations.com project. What I'm going to be talking about ARF. If you recall earlier episode of ARF, ARF, Arena Ratio Fields. Yep, Arena Ratio Fields. We're going to talk about that next on mikesmastermind.com, your pseudo philosophy podcast. So I talk about ultra beingness a lot, and that's sort of the idea where one might be in a certain state, like, hey, you're feeling one with the world, you're happy, or you're perhaps in flow. It doesn't have to be like you're, overstimulated, excited at a party, but it could be that state where you're having a sort of a sense of things where the realization is like, hey, I'm pretty copacetic. I'm all right with the world. Even though you may be dealing with certain things, you feel empowered enough to sort of be able to relate to people. You're not overwhelmed by mood or emotion or some other concern that's got your attention, perhaps all riled up about that. No, we're centered. We're feeling sort of attuned with the universe. I use that word attune quite a bit. And the idea here is that it's an enabling, you could say, effect, and I'm using the word a for effect rather than being the effect and having an effect. The affection is really a matter where there's a certain vibe, and it helps people tune into more of that centeredness, that more true, natural sense of being. And when this is qualified in this way, I call it ultra being because it's sort of like, well, what would be the benefactor impacts this effect uh, as a society if we were sort of more quote unquote consciously connected or attuned to our own lived experiences. So we can get into best practices and talk about a good natured way of ultra being present, loving, and considerate. And this then becomes what I call a long lasting legacy formula because if we can empower others to be the way showers themselves, so it's UBE3 is the formula, ultra being an excellent example of enlightenment is one would be able to experience it, to explore it, to experiment with it. We're now in a quote unquote new realm. And the new realm is the freshness of the moment that we're not necessarily carrying the impacts or the baggage, the karma of the past. We may still have to deal with them, but now we are enabled to do so, really to be so, in such a manner that we can be UB3. We're empowered because we're ultra being. It gives us more sense of responsibility and capability so that we can address matters in this equilibrium. And the premise here of ultra being is to become this UBE3 ultra being excellent example of enlightenment, where we lead by this excellent example. It becomes a practice and also a self-liberation movement. Yep, self-lib, getting out of our own stories, right? Is it liberated from that self, or is it the immersion of the soul self? Whatever that would be, it's up to each person's personal philosophy, and it dates to ancient times, looking at ontology as an understanding in the way of being, so that we can qualify our existence. And for those of us who care and are in this field, and I talked in other podcasts about the CARES model, where we are part of a community action. So it's resourcefulness, but at the same time it's research because it's lived experience. And this quality of engagement is then examined. This is the CARES model of community action, research, engagement. So if we come from this premise of UBE3, we are excellent in a way that we're able to perceive things. And the deliverables, at least in the quality of the research or what gets ascertained or considered, in the very least, if we're just coming up with the question, it is of a fine filtering. And I think allows us more of this greater dimension that I'm now going to talk about, which is the ARF. And I don't know, maybe about 6 or 8 months ago, I've always kind of had this sense that you come into certain spaces and you have a vibe. And I call that more that intimacy in the metasphere, right? We all term, the atmosphere or the climate of a room. We need a more specific term. The French have the word ambiance. That's one level of that sense of things, right? We call it a metasphere, so we can now have this CARES approach as community action researchers to understand what is this engagement. And that could be, again, sort of a vestibular sense from your gut, or just kind of, what's going on here. You're feeling it out and you're listening to what's being heard, and then we can engage for what you really see the big picture. If we're operating any other way, the syntax is not quite correct. It's not going to equal out in a way that's sort of like, well, person can go into synesthesia and get a lot of different inputs, but what's the one that's going to bring it to the big picture you have to start with sort of coming up from one source, what it is that we're present to, and not what is necessarily being presented to us, because it could be purposely commercialized and adulterated. So we're not quite seeing what really is there. We're just seeing a commercial. You get what I mean? So although we can look at this from a semiotic perspective and take apart, what the signs mean, yeah, that can be an interesting science too. But let's come from you could say a 0 point, which is really more of emptiness, that's going to allow whatever revelations or interpretations to kind of wash over, so we can get the bigger picture within greater detail. Okay, so the ARF field, so it's arena ratio fields, it's just sort of looking at the scope of life, and this could be the expanded metasphere, because the metasphere is more the intimate immediacy of the conversation, the company you keep, and sort of just what the endowments are of the environment. And I write about this in Weltschloss, the German word I came up with, putting two German words together, Weltschloss, world dwelling together, so weltschloss.com. Or if you're interested in my ultra being philosophy ideas, you can go to grandtourideas.com to get a tidbit sampling, you know, grandtourideas.com. So back to ARF, and I related it to when you're hearing a dog bark, arf, arf, arf. So like if you're walking towards it, if it's just in your space, it's echoing in your mind. There's something to be said about, you could say, the spatial contours of what the experience is, and the Weltschloss, the world that we're dwelling in. And then I refined it down to what the gems are, the Weltschloss. And I love to use acronyms, so I came up with GEMS. And that is, if we're going to be these, social science researchers, and we care to engage on this level, to look at what's given, or to examine what's given, and have a sense of this is the GEMS. And could have a whole talk about the givens, right? We all kind of have a sense of what's given to us in identity and just sort of the built environment. We can then to examine I call E in the GEMS environs. It does reflect the environment, but really more this imbuing quality to how we're affecting the environment and how it's affecting us, and just sort of an environ type experience. So it's environ. So environ as part of the GEMS, and the milieu, which I'm not pronouncing the French word correctly, but sort of just what people's lives are about, and whatever fragment or distillation or part of the spectrum they're on in their life experience and occupation, status, and just day-to-day experience where they live and what they're doing, what they have to deal with. There's something to be explored, as well as the setting, which is the composite of everything, and where things are in our certain place and time, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, and just sort of really relating to this experience, to what kind of insight we can divine qualifies the ARF, so the arena ratio field, and the ratios in which something could be filtered, or I like to relate to divined, or a person just had this other experience, education, opportunity given to them, or just that they're simply aware that there's a resource available for them, or they come out to a class, or they do a little bit of homework in this area, and they can get a certificate, something where it's going to allow them to consider other possibilities. And that's where we make an impression to value the gems that we have in the Weltschloss, the world that we're dwelling in, to examine what we've built, and then how we can either fix, reform, or deconstruct and take it down elegantly. We can have something that really is of benefit, good for the whole, win-win in every regard. And that's at least the contemplation of where we start things to consider in an arena ratio fields, like what it is that we're examining and why it's of interest when we sense something in the larger space or the environment. Some of it's already been defined, right? It's affecting us. It's there as a dynamic. It could be growing as a concern or something that is existing that ought to be at least addressed. And in this regard, again, it's a consideration. It's a caring model. It's like, well, how do we care for this? Or should we? So these are the dynamics of that. In whatever field that you're in the ARF, there's something there to be examined. And it is the play or the game of life, in the field of life that we're in. And when we consider the gems of what's given, what the environs are, the milieu and the setting, we now have different, say, lens or dimensions that we can look at things and process them in a way that we can consider holistically, whole-brained, in every dimension, that this is fair, this is equitable, we've thought about these things, is there anything that we're missing that we ought to be considering or thinking less of or more of? Because this is what we're examining, right? What really matters, part of our mission, that's giving meaning and the value we give to it, right? And then the proposition that we're coming up with that leads to something. For me, it's a passion. Others, it's their purpose in life, So I want to accommodate the journey. And we can look at desirable goals together in examining the ARF and the CARES model of community action research engagement that really, to me, is a whole new model. And it's transformative because it's a paradigm shift because we're living it in a meaningful way, this life experience. And now we'll be able to come back to it. So in some ways, it's very dynamic because we are talking literally about quote unquote consciousness raising, or at least being attuned to what I define as a level of awareness, which is this ultra being present. There's something about, you could say, about the awareness of being here and now and perfectly present as one it could be pristine in this practice. The potential is really quite perpetually amazing. So it's something for us to consider and to talk about in relating ARF, arena ratio fields, which needs to be scoped out. It's just sort of a dimension that's now been defined in the way that we can relate to it. And we just need to sort of fill it in, right? The clipboard in the arena ratio field as a coach, as a consultant, as a I guess, a cosmonaut exploring consciousness in this realm. It can be something very enriching, enlightening in this regard as we set forth on a new journey and tradition that we've created or continued passing the torch on to the next generation. We're holding it right now, man. We've got it. So let's imbue it. I'd like to get feedback on what, if on a central or deeper sort of bifocal, trifocal level, you read into certain things or you're hearing something that rings true for you, resonates, and you want to share, let me know as we expand this potential. Examining ultra being, UBE3 ultra being, an excellent example of enlightenment, as you know it to be, as you can practice it, being present. How we can explore the ARF, arena ratio fields together. Thank you. Mike Ratner, mikesmastermind.com.